Hi everybody, Brittany here from the Monroe Street Art Center. Today I'm here to talk to you about all things watercolors. So some of you have been ordering our art kits, and if you got our most recent art kit number 3, you will have received your very own pan of watercolors. So whether you're using these, maybe you have an old pan lying around, or perhaps you've been doing a lot of cleaning lately and you found all of your art supplies from 4th grade, and this happens to be one of them. Whatever the case may be, I'm going to show you guys how to recharge up those watercolors and a few techniques that I've learned over time that you can incorporate into your own art making. So one quick tip right away, whenever I'm painting with watercolors, I do like to have 2 containers of water so that number 1, when I go in, I can rinse off most of the pigment right away, and then I can go into that second jar and I can get a nice crisp clean brush for when I go into my next watercolor. Another tip for you, if you're ever making art in a hurry or you need something to dry quickly between layers, you can always grab yourself a hair dryer, plug it in, and go over and dry your painting so that it's quick, easy, and ready for whatever maybe you want to do with it next. So let's grab our favorite paintbrush and let's get started. Let's see. I'm going to grab this one. It's a nice sunny day, so I think I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start with some yellow paint. And what I'm going to show you first is how to do what's called a flat wash. So basically the idea of this is if you were ever going to a paint store to check out colors, maybe you're going to repaint something in your wall, the idea is that it's just all one color, like a swatch. So as you can see, this is just one full red, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start with some yellow. So I'm going in and I'm charging up my yellow paint. Something you can do to create more paint or to make it lighter is you can bring it over into a pan. And you can always add more water to it. The more water you add to a color, the lighter it's going to be. And the more that you swirl it around in your paint, the more pigmented and darker that paint will be. So whatever one you're doing, it doesn't matter here. We just want to make it all one color swatch. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take my brush and I'm going to start to paint my yellow down onto some watercolor paper. You can also use regular paper, but I definitely recommend getting yourself some watercolor paper. It's a bit thicker and it's gonna withstand more water than your regular paper would allow. So I've gone in, I've spread out my color, and here I have just a nice yellow swatch. When it dries, it's all gonna be one color like this. The next technique I'm gonna show you guys today is called a gradient. And basically what that means is you're just taking one color and then you're going to make it either lighter or darker. So when it's all finished, again, it will look something like this gradient. So I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna rinse my brush. I think I'll go with some blue next. I'm gonna just charge up my watercolor. And I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna paint some down on my swatch here. Then I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna rinse my brush. And then I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to pull a little bit more watercolor. I'll rinse again. And then I've got a nice gradient from dark to light. You'll see it's kind of pooling a little bit because I'm on an angle, but when it's dry, it'll be nice and crisp like this. The next technique that I want to show you guys is called wet into wet. And basically what that means is you're taking either paper that's already been painted with water, so it's wet, or you're just taking wet paint and then painting more wet paint into it. So basically it bleeds together and you get really cool results, something like this. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna paint some water down on a paint swatch here. Ah, a masterpiece. Just kidding. But from here I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna pick a color. I think I'll do some purple maybe. And I'm gonna paint it right into my water. And you're gonna see that it's starting to just bleed and move around with the water. So you can turn your paper, it'll drip, it'll move around. You can get all kinds of cool color mixtures with this. So maybe I'll go ahead and I'll add another color in. Maybe I'll do some blue. And you can see it's just really, really beautiful how the colors bleed together. And if you're doing this on a flat surface, it might tend to be a little bit more dotty and like kind of expand. Whereas when you're doing it on an angle like me, it's tending to drip down, causing the colors to bleed in like a downward motion. So you can kind of play around with both. But when it's all dry, again, you're gonna get something like this. The next technique, this is super good if you happen to be painting something, and it's also just kind of a good tool in general. If you've added too much water to something, you can blot it with either a paper towel, a tissue, toilet paper. I guess there's not a lot around these days, but whatever you can find to take some of that watercolor off of your paper. This is called blotting, so just blotting it off, it adds a really nice texture. I find that with harder papers or harder towels like paper towel, you get more of like kind of a crunchy texture, whereas tissues are going to give you like a really soft texture when you blot it off. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to paint my swatch here. Got a nice swatch, and then I just take my paper towel or whatever it is I want to use, and I just blot it down on top of the paper. And then again, when it's all dry, you get some really fun textures. The next technique I'm going to show you, this is fun because it's something that you might already have at home. So if you happen to have any salt laying around, you can actually mix it with your watercolor and get some really fun textures from this. So salt, it will give you a really cool crystallized texture that looks like this. Whether you're using a fine salt or a kosher salt, a more coarse salt, you're still going to get results. It just kind of depends which salt you're using to see what you can experiment and what textures you get. So if you happen to have a big thing of salt laying around, I have some kosher salt here. It's nice and coarse. Generally, whenever I'm using salt, I like to move it into a smaller container so that I can just take out a few pinches at a time, rather than taking my giant salt box and pouring it all over my paper. So here I have a little container with some salt in it. I'm going to paint another swatch. I think I'll do maybe some orange. And then I'm just going to take a little bit of salt out of this container here. I'm going to do a pinch. Maybe I'll do 2 pinches. However many pinches you're feeling. And then when it's all dry, you can take your finger and you can rub off the salt, and it will leave you that crystallized texture. But you want to make sure again that it's completely dry before you rub anything off. Or maybe you do like just the texture of having the salt on there. You can totally leave the salt on there too. But you definitely want to make sure you're doing this technique while your paint is still wet. Otherwise, if you're just putting salt on dry paint, it's not really going to do anything. But that is going to be salt. Again, one more time, super pretty. The next technique that I'm going to do, it is another thing that you might have lying around. It is isopropyl alcohol. So you can use either the 90 or the 70, it comes in a few different percentages. But this adds a really, really neat, unique design to watercolor. It tends to look something like this. It has a bit of a crater texture to it almost. It's super fun to experiment with, but I kind of think that watercolor in general is kind of an experiment because it's really fluid and you don't always know how your watercolors are going to turn out, but that's kind of the fun of the art process. So I'm going to paint another swatch. I think I'll do a nice bright red now. So I've gone in, I have my red swatch. I transferred some of my alcohol into this nice little dropper bottle. So maybe you have an extra dropper bottle laying around, you can put it in. Maybe you have a dropper, or even if you just take a paintbrush, dip it in the alcohol and let it drip over top. It's still gonna give you the result nonetheless. So I'm gonna take this, open it up. I'm gonna take a little bit from my dropper here. And then I'm just gonna take it and I'm going to drop it over top of my color swatch. Art Science. And then again, you can see this one is already starting to make its watercolor magic right away. But when it's dry, you'll get that really cool kind of crater look like this. The next technique I'm going to show you, we're going to be incorporating another art material, and that is going to be oil pastels. So if you have any oil pastels laying around, maybe your neighbor has someone, anyone, maybe you're going to order some online, whatever the case may be, I'm going to use just regular old oil pastels. Oil and water resist each other. So if I were to take some pastel here, maybe I'll draw some scribbles, but scribbles are in fact art. I went ahead, I just picked any old design, I drew it on my paper. I'm gonna go ahead now and I'm gonna paint watercolor on top of it. Perhaps I'll do some orange on top of the blue. It will complement each other really well. You'll see right away that the oil and the water are resisting one another, leaving you with your really cool design in the background of your watercolor swatch. And then the next technique I'm going to share with you guys today is pretty much our last technique I have for you. Again, there are a lot more than the ones that I've shown you, but these are my favorites, is masking tape. So perhaps you have just a plain old roll of masking tape laying around. What you can do with it is you can either create a really nice border on the edges of your painting, and what that will do is that will make a really cool frame. Or you can take masking tape and you can just take a few pieces and tape it down on a piece of paper and paint over top of it. And what happens is it leaves whatever is underneath it that nice white paper color. So my recommendation for this is when you are peeling the masking tape to kind of go ahead and maybe put it on your shirt, maybe stick it to your pants a couple times just to make the tape a little bit less sticky. And then that way, when you peel the tape off later, you don't have to worry about it peeling off any of your paper. It's just gonna leave you with the white color underneath. So I'm gonna go ahead and stick a couple pieces down like this. I'll take my color. I think I'll go with a nice magenta. Paint over top. And then ideally you want to let this dry. You can let it air dry. You can get that blow dryer out and dry it really quickly. And then when you peel those pieces of tape off, it will leave whatever tape shape you put down on your paper. Or again, if you went around and made a tape border, when you peel that off, it's going to give you a really nice, crisp frame for your watercolor painting. A cool thing about masking is not only does it come in tape, it does come in a couple other forms with watercolors. You can get yourself a masking pen and you can make really, really precise designs with a pen, or it even comes in a bit of a bottle form. Shake it up really well. It's essentially kind of like liquid latex. You can paint it down, whatever your design is, and then when it's completely dry, you can use paint on top of it. And then when that's all dried together, you can use either your finger or an eraser and you can rub the masking fluid right off. And it leaves you with that nice crisp paper underneath. So those are all the techniques that I have for you today. Quick though, this is a little bit of masking fluid, so you can see that masking fluid is a little bit more organic in shape, whereas the tape is a bit more boxy. But just to give you an idea of what both of those kind of look like. But those are all the techniques that I have for you guys today. There are a few more. See what you can come up with. Experiment with your art materials and see what you can put together. But thanks for watching and have fun creating.